Okay, so welcome back to another video. Today, briefly talking about trauma, right? And like if you grew up in the Western society, which most of us have in the school system and whatever, it's very likely that you've experienced some form of trauma, right? Like we all have traumas stored inside of us, unless you're like an ascended master and you've like liberated from this life, right? But essentially, when I say trauma, like a lot of people think like, okay, like, oh, I was in like a car accident or a physical trauma or in a war or, like things like sexual abuse and different things like this, which obviously are all forms of trauma. But on a basic level, as children, like the little things can be like traumatizing, right? Like when we're little children and we have the basic needs of like attachment to our mother and to our parents, to our family, and like little moments where we feel like we're not being taken care of, or we have the attention, or we've been told to shut up, or maybe like physical like slapping or like hitting or whatever to children, that can be very, very traumatizing, because essentially as a kid, your defenses, you can't defend yourself. You're very dependent on your parents, your family, and the society, right? So it's kind of, we go into these fear responses of fight or flight or freeze, and that stays stuck inside of our body. So essentially, like the benefits of looking into your trauma, like why look into this kind of stuff, right, is that you begin to unlock a lot of these fear patterns that we have. And for me, how I discovered this concept of trauma again was like through things like self-development. So I started learning things about like social dynamics and like online business and different things like this. And eventually you begin to realize that, for example, in online business, like you have all the plans, the ideas of how to make money or something, but you're not doing it because you feel like there's a block inside, right? And you don't know really what's holding you back. And there's this internal blockage. And I think a lot of young men, they lack that confidence to take action, to believe in themselves and to express themselves, whether that's on a sales call or like reaching out to clients or providing results or like going after their dreams in general, right? Like the goals that they have for themselves. And eventually, if you look deeper and deeper into kind of the mindset world of self-development and stuff, at the core of it is this issue of trauma, right? So we have all of these fears holding us back. And like the self-development industry is kind of based on like neuro-linguistic programming from things like from Tony Robbins and whatever, which was more popularized, which is kind of, no, I feel the fear inside of me, but I'm just going to use my mindset and be productive and take action, take massive action, which is good at one level, but really you're not dealing with the core issue of what you're feeling inside. Like for me, it's always made sense and more productive. Why don't you just deal with that fear? Like, why is that there in the first place? Right? So essentially the benefit is like, once you begin to heal all these things, one, you begin to come back to your true self and have the original confidence that you were born with, right? The original desires. Because if you look at a little child who's like 2-3 years old, they're free, they're open, they're alive, because they haven't really been traumatized by the system yet. Abandonment, going through the school system, all of these different things, right? So they're more free. So you begin to connect more with that original being, like your inner child in a way, right? To connect with what you want and who you are. And also, like your trauma, it sends off an energetic frequency too. So like, again, like yesterday's video was about like the law of attraction, right? Like your emotions, they send off an energetic frequency and you attract things into your life. If you're living based on like trauma patterns and like all these lower emotions, you begin to attract these lower frequencies into your life through opportunities and things, and the lack of opportunities, money problems, relationship problems, all of these things. So trauma is really important to look into. So what is trauma, right? Like obviously it's become like more popular, like heal trauma, heal yourself, all these things, right? But what is it? At its basic level, the way I see it is trauma it's an emotional wound, right? Obviously you can have physical trauma as well, but I'm talking more about emotional trauma here. But physical and emotional are very connected. They're basically the same thing. The mind is the body, right? So essentially with emotional trauma, it's an emotional wound that is stored in the body, right? So when we have traumatic experiences, right? Let's say, for example, we were a little kid and in our mind, we thought that we were being abandoned, right? And that's very traumatizing because you're dependent and you can't survive by yourself as a child. Basically, we have certain emotions in that situation that are very, very challenging, and we don't know how to deal with those emotions. So what we do is that we store them in the body, in the emotional body, right? In the physical body, it manifests as well. And they stay there for as long as we don't release them, right? So we have these traumatic experiences, but it's really key to understand that trauma isn't what happened to you. It doesn't matter what happened to you. It's not the physical thing like, oh, I was abandoned, or oh, I was hit, or oh, I was in a war or a physical accident. That's not the trauma. The trauma is your interpretation and the emotional wound that is stored in your body, okay? That stays there. So essentially, like, trauma is our interpretation of what happened, right? So it can happen in kind of two ways. In this physical life here, what has happened throughout your history, that's why it's good to understand, like, your childhood, for example, what happened in like the first 7 years of life, the teenage years, because these years are so crucial to our development, and understanding that history. But also, like, in past lives, in the lives of ancestors, and the collective history as well. Like, obviously this is a channel for young men, and looking at the collective history for young men, like looking back at like World War II, World War I, like, for example, these kind of collective histories. Imagine the amount of trauma that was experienced that is like embedded in the collective trauma of like young men fighting in war, for example, right? And obviously our ancestors, and like leading down like generational trauma. So the first step is kind of like to look into our history. If we look into our past, we kind of get clues into what happened. But the problem is, if we stay too trapped looking in history, looking in the past, it's like we're not really dealing with the core issue, because again, like, trauma is your interpretation of what happened in that moment, and the stored energy in your energetic body and your physical body, which are pretty much the same thing. So in order to really deal with that trauma, we have to begin to deal with ourselves, right? And the key to all of it that I found really is dealing with your emotions, you know, because the emotion is the storage of that trauma. And once we begin to liberate that energy, as I mentioned in the last video again with the law of attraction, we begin to open up more space for new energy to enter, and we start to attract new things into our life, and we begin to connect with who we really are, our purpose, what we want to do, right? And essentially this is the hero's journey, the inside journey of healing your wound, right? The sacred wound that we all have. And finally, quickly, like on the philosophy of trauma and everything, if you look at other dimensional levels of why this trauma exists, it all comes from the fact that we feel separated from source, from God, from the universe, from the creator, from whatever. Because we have these egoic senses, right? We have our 5 senses in this physical world, and we become so attached, and we kind of forget who that we are, and we're attached to the Maya, the physical world, right? And that's not bad. We have this experience for a reason, to live our dreams, to create our reality on this 3D plane. But the problem comes in separation. That's why things like yoga the meaning of yoga is union, to unify again with source, to recognize who that we are, to heal that separation, right? So we all, at the core of it, we're all one, and we all suffer from this collective separation, right? That is the sacred wound that we all hold. So real briefly, not to make this video too long, is kind of how would you go about healing trauma, right? Like, you can begin to understand, okay, maybe I'm not succeeding in my life, maybe I don't have the confidence or the desire to do what I want to do, and I feel blocked from expressing myself because I have like these deep traumas and these pains from the past. That makes a lot of sense, right? The key isn't to go and do mental masturbation, learning about psychology and reading every book and going down that rabbit hole, right? The key is to actually do the work, right? Because we're so mental. One of the ways that we learn how to deal with trauma, which is stored in the body, is that we escape to the mind, right? We stay physical, thinking all the time, trying to understand the history and understand what happened. But that's an escape from the body. So the key concept to dealing with these traumatic patterns and these pains and these fears that are holding us back is to first connect with the body, okay? And I learned something from the process of Gene Keys, which I talked about in a previous video, of how to deal with shadows, right? And how to deal with the shadow patterns and the traumas that we have. And it's kind of a 3-step process. And I would add another step to it that's before this, which is awareness, right? First, you need to become aware of the shadow, which again, like talking about Gene Keys, is a great way to become aware of the shadows and the patterns that we have. Right, it's a complete map of that, and you can't like look away from it because it's just telling you to your face, like, look, this is the shadow patterns that you have. But first, to become aware, right, and that's also body awareness. And a great way to start to become aware of yourself is through things like meditation, right, simple practices, eating healthy, connecting more with your body, going out to nature, connecting with these emotions that are stored in the body. Okay, the next step, which is the 3-step process from Gene Keys, from Richard Rudd, is to allow the emotions, right? We spend so much time trying to like psychoanalyze, right? From this culture of like Sigmund Freud and psychoanalysis and stuff, where I obviously like the beginnings of psychotherapy and stuff. We like to analyze all the time, again, in the mind. But the first step is not to analyze or to understand or to try and change the emotion. The first step is you just allow it to happen. And that is the key step there, because once you allow the emotion to come up, you kind of begin that process of transformation, right? There's a great book called Internal Family Systems. I forget the author's name of that book, but it's a whole like school of therapy. And it's kind of like the philosophy is that we have different parts to our personality, right? We think that we're congruent and that we're one person. But it's like we all have this like bipolar, multipolar like personality and different personalities inside of ourselves. And they kind of fight for each other to have control. And basically these personalities come because of our traumas and our fear. They're like a survival mechanism to obviously continue your survival as a little child or whenever the trauma happened, right? So most people fight with their personalities, like, oh, this is right or this is wrong, or I'm this, I'm that, and this part of me needs to shut up and this part of me needs to be like, this is my mask to the world, right? But the key is to allow these personalities to express, because everything has polarity. And once we allow the shadows part of ourselves to express and allow to feel, it naturally begins to transform into its light side, right? Into the highest state of consciousness in that form. Everything's polarity. But in the society that we live in, we cast away darkness. Like, darkness is bad, darkness is evil, right? Which is like the repression of the feminine energy, actually. So it's kind of allowing that energy to come up that we're all afraid of, and it kind of naturally begins to transform into the next 2 steps, which is to accept that emotion, which comes quite naturally. Once you begin to allow these emotions to come up, you begin to accept them, which is obviously the next natural step. You don't really have to force that. And then finally to embrace that, to allow your shadow to become part of you, to accept it and not wanting to change anything about it. And that's when it comes into its more conscious form. And that really is the path of individuation, right? This concept of individuation, becoming whole, becoming one again. We need to accept those dark parts of ourselves, because again, like, personal development is all about, no, I'm going to the light, I have these goals, I'm taking action without looking at the pain that's driving all of that. And that's the key to transformation. The stuff that we're not looking at, that's where the real treasure is, right? So yeah, briefly, just some tools to help you on that path if you're interested in stuff like this is, again, Gene Keys. Look into the video that I made on Gene Keys for more information about that. Start with basic meditation. I recommended Joe Dispenza in the previous video. And then also body practices, right? Like things like bioenergetics. Look into some of Elliot Horse's videos, basic bioenergetics, different therapies. The Human Biography is a great source of information there by Laura Goodman. to look more into your history, Akashic records, and obviously things like plant medicines, which is kind of like an holistic approach to everything. Like plant medicine is ultimately like a combination of all the different types of therapies, of body work, of spirituality, Akashicals, everything, dimensional healing. But only look into that if you really feel the call for that. That's not something to take lightly, right? Like that's something to do if you really feel the call in that way. So yeah, I hope I got across the importance of looking into our traumas and stuff like this. Again, we live in a culture where if you say something about trauma, it's like, oh no, like they're being like I don't know, there's like a rejection, you know, looking into your pain and your emotions. It's like, as a man, it's like, oh, he's weak, he's whatever. But for me, what I found, that's the real strength. For the people who are willing to look into their emotional side, that's where the treasure lies, and that's where the true courage comes, because it's so difficult. That's why we run away from it and we cast it away. Right, so I hope that video was helpful. And yeah, I will see you in the next one.